Before we begin, I need to tell you something about this book and about the man who wrote it. Friedrich Nietzsche, born in 1844 in Rücken in Prussia, the son of a Lutheran minister who died when Nietzsche was 4, who grew up surrounded by women, his mother, his sister, his grandmother, his aunts, who was brilliant beyond anything his teachers had seen, who read Greek and Latin before most boys could read their own language, who became a professor at 24 without completing his PhD. So impressive was his work that the university simply gave him the chair, who then, slowly, inexorably, over the course of a decade, became the most uncomfortable thinker of the 19th century, perhaps of any century, because Nietzsche did something that no philosopher had quite done before. He turned the tools of philosophy on philosophy itself. He took the questions that philosophers use to examine the world and turned them on the philosophers and on their values and on morality itself, and asked, where did these values come from? Not, are they true? Not, are they right? But where did they come from? Who created them? Why? What conditions gave birth to the idea of good and evil? What kind of people found it useful to think in these categories? And what does it say about those people that these were the values they chose? This is the Genealogy of Morals, published in 1887. 3 essays, each one more devastating than the last, about where morality comes from, about what guilt actually is, about what the ascetic ideal, the ideal of self-denial, actually means, and what it costs. This is not a comfortable book. It was not meant to be. Nietzsche is not trying to make you comfortable. He is trying to make you see. And what you will see, if you look clearly, will change how you understand every value you hold. Every idea of right and wrong. Every inherited belief about what is good and what is evil. Every single one. This is the Genealogy of Morals by Friedrich Nietzsche. Nietzsche writes, "We are unknown to ourselves, we men of knowledge, and with good reason. We have never sought ourselves. How could it happen that we should ever find ourselves? It has rightly been said that where your treasure is, there will your heart be also. Our treasure is where the beehives of our knowledge are. We are constantly making for them as born winged creatures and collectors of spiritual honey. There is one thing alone that we are really concerned about, from the heart, bringing something home. We have never sought ourselves." This is how Nietzsche begins. Not with the argument, not with the thesis, not with the conclusion he is building toward, with the confession, "We men of knowledge, who have studied everything, who have examined everything, who have dissected everything, have never examined ourselves, have never questioned our own values, our own assumptions, the values we were born into, that we inherited, the way we inherited the color of our eyes, without choosing, without asking why." He continues, "For our purposes it is not permitted that we should know ourselves. We are strangers to ourselves, and if we weigh ourselves with the right scales, we must admit that the value of these values themselves must first be called in question. The value of these values must be called in question. This is the project, not to say that morality is wrong, not to celebrate immorality, to ask the prior question: where did these moral values come from? Who made them? Under what conditions? In what direction did they point the people? Who created them? What life did they serve? What kind of human being found them necessary? These are the questions of the genealogy. He continues, under what conditions did man devise these value judgments, good and evil, and what value do they themselves possess? Or furthered human prosperity? Are they a sign of distress, of impoverishment, of the degeneration of life? Or is there revealed in them the plenitude, force, and will of life, its courage, certainty, future? Its courage, certainty, future. Or distress, impoverishment, degeneration. These are the two possibilities that Nietzsche sets up, and then spends 3 essays arguing that much of what we call morality is the second, not the strength of life, but the weakness of life masquerading as virtue. He continues, I discovered for myself that the greater part of moral philosophy to date had been mere symptom reading of moral prejudices, a symptom of a deeper diagnosis that had never been made. It struck me that I had to determine the origin of our moral valuations, that problem of the value of pity and the morality of pity. That was the beginning. From then on, I have never ceased to see it as one of the main philosophic problems so far. The problem of morale, of the value of the unegotistical, the instincts of pity, self-abnegation, and self-sacrifice, which Schopenhauer had for so long gilded and apotheosized. The direct attack on his former idol. Nietzsche had loved Schopenhauer as a young man, had read him with the passion of the convert, and then had turned and seen what Schopenhauer celebrated, the will-less, the self-denying, the pitying, as something to be questioned rather than praised. The genealogy begins with this questioning of the most celebrated virtues: pity, self-abnegation, self-sacrifice. Are these actually good? Nietzsche will spend 3 essays asking this question, and you will not like all of his answers. Nietzsche writes, these English psychologists, whom we have to thank for the only attempts hitherto made to arrive at a history of morality, are no small riddle to me. I confess that just that which has always attracted me most about them is precisely their lack of historical spirit, their leaving themselves in the lurch by the very instinct of modern ideas. He is criticizing the English moral philosophers who tried to explain the origin of good and evil by utility, by what is useful to the greatest number, and who said things were called good because they were useful, and the usefulness was forgotten, and only the praise remained. Nietzsche says this is wrong, and the mistake is a lack of historical sense, of the ability to see how different the past was, how different the people of the past were, who created these values. He continues, the judgment good did not originate among those among whom goodness was shown. Much rather it was the good themselves, that is to say, the noble, the mighty, the high-stationed, the high-minded, who felt themselves and their actions to be good. That is to say, of the first order, in contrast to all the low-minded, common, and plebeian. This is the central claim of Essay 1, the first of the great reversals that Nietzsche performs. Good did not originate with those to whom good was done, with the receivers of goodness, with the humble, with the meek. Good originated with the noble themselves, who simply called themselves good, not as a moral judgment, not as a claim to virtue, but as a factual description of their own superiority. The noble man called himself good the way a tall man calls himself tall. It was simply a description of what he was. And the low, the common, the plebeian he called bad. Not evil, bad, schlecht in German, which means merely inferior, of lesser quality, like cheap goods compared to fine ones. He continues, the pathos of nobility and distance, as I have said, the chronic and despotic esprit de corps and fundamental instinct of a higher ruling class in its relation to a lower class. That is the origin of the antithesis of good and bad. The master's right of giving names goes so far that it is permissible to look upon language itself as the expression of the power of the masters. The master's right of giving names, language, the first tool of power. The noble class names itself, and in naming itself, establishes the categories by which everyone else will be judged. Good equals us, bad equals them, and the them accepted these categories for a very long time, without question, without resentment. He continues, the noble type of man regards himself as the determiner of values. He does not need to be approved of. He passes the judgment. What is injurious to me is injurious in itself. He knows that it is he himself only who confers honor on things. He is a creator of values. He honors whatever he recognizes in himself. Such a morality is self-glorification. In the foreground, there is the feeling of plenitude, of power, which seeks to overflow, the happiness of high tension, the consciousness of wealth, which would give and bestow. The consciousness of wealth, which would give and bestow. The noble person does not give because they are commanded, does not give because they fear punishment if they do not, does not give from pity for the suffering of the recipient, gives because they have so much that giving is the natural overflow of their abundance, the way a river overflows its banks, not from intention, but from the simple pressure of too much water. This is the noble morality, the master morality, the morality of yes, of abundance, of the self that creates rather than the self that reacts. He continues, while the noble man lives in trust and openness with himself, the man of resentment is neither upright, nor naive, nor honest and straightforward with himself. His soul squints. His spirit loves hiding places, secret paths, and back doors. Everything covert attracts him as his world, his security, his refreshment. He understands how to keep silence, how not to forget, how to wait, how to be provisionally self-deprecating and humble. Ressentiment, the French word that Nietzsche uses in the German text because no German word captures it exactly. Ressentiment, not resentment exactly, not bitterness exactly, not envy exactly. The combination of all three, plus the inability to act, plus the consequent turning inward of the hostility that cannot be expressed outward. The person with resentment cannot strike directly, cannot act from abundance, cannot simply be what they are, because they are defined in reaction, always in reaction to the other, to the noble, to the powerful, to the one who has what they lack. He continues, the slave revolt in morality begins when resentment itself becomes creative and gives birth to values. The resentment of natures that are denied the true reaction, that of deeds, and compensate themselves with an imaginary revenge, while every noble morality develops from a triumphant affirmation of itself. Slave morality from the outset says no to what is outside, what is different, what is not itself, and this no is its creative deed. The slave revolt in morality, this is the center, the pivot, the moment around which everything in the genealogy turns. The slave revolt, not a literal revolt, not the uprising of the physically enslaved, a spiritual revolution in which the values of the weak and the subjugated overturned the values of the strong and the noble through a single move, the most brilliant, most consequential move in the history of human thought, the move of calling the powerful evil, not merely bad, not merely inferior, not merely other, evil. He continues, this inversion of values, this necessary determination from the standpoint of the slave, by means of which the miserable alone are the good, the poor, the powerless, the low alone are the good, the suffering, the deprived, the sick, the ugly are the only pious people, the only ones saved. Salvation is for them alone, while you, the powerful and noble, are on the contrary, the evil, the cruel, the lustful, the insatiate, the godless. To all eternity you shall be the unblessed, the accursed, and damned. You shall be the unblessed, the accursed, and damned. The reversal in one move, the slave morality, transforms weakness into virtue, suffering into election, powerlessness into righteousness, and transforms strength into sin, power into evil, the abundance of the noble into the mark of the damned. And it worked. This is Nietzsche's most devastating claim. It worked. The slave revolt succeeded, not through force, through the slow, patient work of 2,000 years of Christian morality, which taught the entire Western world to see power as dangerous, wealth as suspicious, strength as something requiring justification, and to see the meek as blessed, the poor as sacred, the suffering as redeemed. He continues, this Jesus of Nazareth, the incarnate gospel of love, this bringer of salvation and victory to the poor and sick, was he not seduction in its most uncanny and irresistible form? A seduction and a detour to precisely those Jewish values and new ideals. Has not Israel, precisely by the detour of this Redeemer, this ostensible opponent and disintegrator of Israel, attained the final goal of its sublime craving for vengeance? The final goal of its sublime craving for vengeance. This is the most provocative claim in the entire genealogy, and the most important to understand correctly. Nietzsche is not attacking Jesus the individual or the Jewish people. He is making a historical claim about the mechanism by which a subjugated people achieved a revolution without weapons. The revolution of values, in which the values of Rome, the values of the strong, the noble, the powerful, were defeated, not by arms, by the slow, patient victory of the idea that the meek shall inherit the earth. He continues, Rome has been defeated beyond all doubt. There is admittedly, in the Renaissance, an uncanny and splendid reawakening of the classical ideal, the noble method of evaluating all things. Rome itself moved like one, awakened from seeming death, under the impression of the new, Jewish Rome that was built over it. But then came the German Reformation, and Rousseau, and the French Revolution, and the triumph of ressentiment once more. Thereupon followed Napoleon, that synthesis of the inhuman and superhuman, that synthesis of the inhuman and superhuman, Napoleon, who appears in Nietzsche as the clearest example of what he means by the noble type. Not because of his wars, because of his quality. The self-creating person, the one who wills, the one who does not wait for the permission of the herd, who does not need the approval of the crowd, who simply is what he is and acts accordingly. He continues, the two opposed values, good and noble on the one hand, and evil and despicable on the other, have waged a fearful struggle for thousands of years, and although the second value has had the advantage for a long time, there are not wanting places where the contest still hangs undecided. It might even be said that it has since then been raised to an ever higher level and become more and more profound, more and more spiritual, so that nowadays there is perhaps no more distinguishing feature of the higher nature than that it should be a battleground for these opposites, and really a battleground for these opposites. The higher nature, the more developed person, is not the one who has resolved this tension, who has chosen one side and lives in peaceful certainty, but the one in whom the tension is greatest, most alive, most honest, the battleground of good and noble versus evil and despicable, the person who has not settled for the easy answer of either tradition. This is the beginning of what Nietzsche calls the revaluation of all values, not the overthrow of morality, the honest examination of it, to be the most difficult thing any human mind has ever attempted. Nietzsche writes, the beast of prey, the magnificent blonde beast, avidly rampant for plunder and victory, this hidden core needs to erupt from time to time. The animal has to get out again, has to go back into the wilderness. Roman, Arabian, Germanic, Japanese nobility, Homeric heroes, Scandinavian Vikings, they all shared this need. The blonde beast, the most misunderstood phrase in all of Nietzsche, the most misused, the most deliberately distorted by those who came after him and claimed to speak in his name. He is not describing a racial ideal. He is describing a psychological type, the animal energy, the instinctive vitality, the will to act without the overlay of guilt and self-suppression that slave morality has placed upon it. The lion, not the domesticated dog, who wags its tail, hoping to be fed. He continues, "At the base of all these noble races, the beast of prey cannot be mistaken. The magnificent blonde beast, avidly rampant for plunder and victory. This hidden core needs to erupt from time to time. The animal has to get out again, has to go back into the wilderness. Roman, Arabian, Japanese nobility, the Homeric heroes, they all shared this need." He continues, "One cannot fail to see at the core of all these noble races the beast of prey, the splendid blonde beast, going out in search of spoil and victory. This hidden core needs relief from time to time. The animal must get out, must return to the wild. Roman, Arab, Germanic and Japanese nobility, Homeric heroes, Scandinavian Vikings, they are all alike in this need." He continues, "The deep and icy mistrust which the German still arouses today whenever he gets power is an echo of that inextinguishable horror with which Europe observed for whole centuries that raging of the blonde Germanic beast. Although, between the old Germanic tribes and us Germans, there is hardly a conceptual relationship, let alone one of blood. I have pointed to the anxiety of the English toward the German. This is understandable when one remembers that it was English culture, specifically, that trained the Germans to peace. The training to peace through Christian morality, through the values of self-denial, through the gradual, centuries-long domestication of the noble beast into the tame animal that no longer frightens anyone, including itself." He continues, "One may be right in continuing to fear the blonde beast at the core of all noble races and being on one's guard. But who would not 100 times over prefer to fear when one can also admire rather than not fear, but thereby permanently retain the disgusting spectacle of the ill-constituted, dwarfed, stunted, envenomed, the disgusting spectacle. To the dangerous noble, the safe mediocrity, the comfortable smallness, the person who has been so thoroughly trained to renounce that they have nothing left to renounce, because there was never anything to begin with. Nietzsche prefers the dangerous, magnificent beast to the safe, stunted, envenomed mediocrity." He continues, "The well-being of the majority and the well-being of the few are opposite viewpoints of value. To consider the former as of itself the higher value may be left to the naivety of English biologists. All sciences have henceforth to prepare the way for the future task of the philosopher. This task understood as the solution of the problem of value, the determination of the order of rank among values. The order of rank among values, not the equality of values, not all values equal, not all ways of living equally valid, not all human beings equally developed. The order of rank, which is the most aristocratic and most offensive and most important idea in Nietzsche. He believes in hierarchy, not of birth, of achievement, of what has been overcome, of what has been created, of the quality of the spirit that has been developed. And this hierarchy he will spend 3 essays defending against the democratic leveling instinct, the herd instinct that wants everyone equal, not by raising the low, by pulling down the high. Nietzsche writes, "The beast of prey, the magnificent blonde beast, avidly rampant for plunder and victory. This hidden core needs to erupt from time to time. The animal has to get out again, has to go back into the wilderness." Roman, Arabian, Germanic, Japanese nobility, Homeric heroes, Scandinavian Vikings, they all shared this need. The blonde beast, the most misunderstood phrase in all of Nietzsche, the most misused, the most deliberately distorted by those who came after him and claimed to speak in his name. He is not describing a racial ideal. He is describing a psychological type, the animal energy, the instinctive vitality, the will to act, without the overlay of guilt and self-suppression that slave morality has placed upon it. The lion, not the domesticated dog, who wags its tail, hoping to be fed. He continues, "At the base of all these noble races, the beast of prey cannot be mistaken. The magnificent blonde beast, avidly rampant for plunder and victory. This hidden core needs to erupt from time to time. The animal has to get out again, has to go back into the wilderness. Roman, Arabian, Japanese nobility, the Homeric heroes, they all shared this need." He continues, "One cannot fail to see at the core of all these noble races the beast of prey, the splendid blonde beast, going out in search of spoil and victory. This hidden core needs relief from time to time. The animal must get out, must return to the wild. Roman, Arab, Germanic and Japanese nobility, Homeric heroes, Scandinavian Vikings, they are all alike in this need." He continues, "The deep and icy mistrust which the German still arouses today whenever he gets power is an echo of that inextinguishable horror with which Europe observed for whole centuries that raging of the blonde Germanic beast. Although, between the old Germanic tribes and us Germans, there is hardly a conceptual relationship, let alone one of blood. I have pointed to the anxiety of the English toward the German. This is understandable when one remembers that it was English culture, specifically, that trained the Germans to peace. The training to peace through Christian morality, through the values of self-denial, through the gradual, centuries-long domestication of the noble beast into the tame animal that no longer frightens anyone, including itself. He continues, "One may be right in continuing to fear the blonde beast at the core of all noble races and being on one's guard. But who would not 100 times over prefer to fear when one can also admire rather than not fear, but thereby permanently retain the disgusting spectacle of the ill-constituted, dwarfed, stunted, envenomed, the disgusting spectacle. To the dangerous noble, the safe mediocrity, the comfortable smallness, the person who has been so thoroughly trained to renounce that they have nothing left to renounce, because there was never anything to begin with. Nietzsche prefers the dangerous, magnificent beast to the safe, stunted, envenomed mediocrity." He continues, "The well-being of the majority and the well-being of the few are opposite viewpoints of value. To consider the former as of itself the higher value may be left to the naivety of English biologists. all sciences have henceforth to prepare the way for the future task of the philosopher. This task, understood as the solution of the problem of value, the determination of the order of rank among values. The order of rank among values, not the equality of values, not all values equal, not all ways of living equally valid, not all human beings equally developed. The order of rank, which is the most aristocratic and most offensive and most important idea in Nietzsche. He believes in hierarchy, not of birth, of achievement, of what has been overcome, of what has been created, of the quality of the spirit that has been developed. And this hierarchy he will spend 3 essays defending against the democratic leveling instinct, the herd instinct that wants everyone equal, not by raising the low, by pulling down the high. Nietzsche writes, "The knightly aristocratic value judgments presupposed a powerful physicality, a flourishing, abundant, even overflowing health, together with that which serves to preserve it, war, adventure, hunting, dancing, war games, and in general, all that involves vigorous, free, joyful activity. The priestly noble method of valuation has other opposites than the knightly. The priestly caste finds its first opponent in the warrior caste, with whom it competes for power. All that the warrior prizes as good, all the signs of overflowing health, strength, war, adventure, and exuberance, the priest regards with deep suspicion. With deep suspicion, the priest who cannot win through physical strength, who has no army, no sword, no physical power, and who therefore must win through other means, the only means available to the physically weak, the revaluation, not good, making health suspect, making wealth dangerous, making power the mark of the corrupt." He continues, "The priests are the most evil enemies. But why? Because they are the most impotent. It is because of their impotence that in them hatred grows to monstrous and uncanny proportions, to the most spiritual and poisonous kind of hatred. The truly great haters in world history have always been priests, brilliant haters. The world has hardly known an intellect so great as that of the priest. Human history would be a dull and stupid thing without the spirit that the impotent have introduced into it. Without the spirit that the impotent have introduced. This is Nietzsche at his most complex. He is not simply praising the warrior and condemning the priest. He recognizes the enormous creative power of resentment. The priests, the impotent, the weak who cannot act physically, have introduced the most powerful ideas in human history, precisely because they had to overcome through ideas what they could not overcome through force. The depth of their thinking, the subtlety of their strategy, the patience of their work is genuinely impressive and genuinely dangerous." He continues, "Let us consider by way of example 2 sets of opposing values. Noble morality, good, powerful, beautiful, happy, favored by the gods. Slave morality, evil, ugly, unhappy, unfavored by the gods. And then the revaluation, evil, suffering, deprived, ugly, the truly good. Good, powerful, beautiful, rich, the truly evil. Can you see it? The complete inversion, What was at the top is now at the bottom. What was at the bottom is now at the top. Through the creative act of renaming the slave revolt in morality. The slave revolt in morality. And Nietzsche asks, not whether this was evil, whether it was honest, whether the inversion truly served life, or whether it was an act of revenge disguised as morality. He continues, this Jesus of Nazareth, was he not seduction in its most uncanny and irresistible form? Seduction and bypath to precisely those Jewish values and new ideals. Has not Israel, precisely by the bypath of this Redeemer, this ostensible opponent and dissolver of Israel, reached the final goal of its sublime craving for vengeance? Is it not due to the black magic of the truly great politics of revenge, of a far-seeing, subterranean, slowly advancing, and premeditated revenge, that Israel has to all apparent ends had to deny and sacrifice the actual instrument of its revenge before all the world, as if it were a mortal enemy, so that all the world could without suspicion swallow the bait? And could one, from a very refined cleverness, do anything more dangerous than this very thing? On one side stand the noble values, beautiful, powerful, happy. On the other, the lowly values, suffering, ugly, deprived. With the sign reversed, the powerless become the chosen, the suffering become the blessed, the ugly become the beautiful in God's eyes, and the powerful become the damned. And the powerful become the damned. This is the reversal that Nietzsche traces through the history of Western morality. He continues, the Romans were the strong and the noble, and no people in the world has ever been stronger or nobler or more worthy of admiration. Everything that is noble is owed to Rome. Every trace and inscription delights. When one considers what Rome stood for, what Rome willed, one feels almost reverence. Almost reverence. Nietzsche, the classicist, the lover of antiquity, who studied Greek and Latin before he studied anything else, the Rome of the Republic, the Rome of the warriors, the Rome of the old virtus, strength, courage, excellence. He continues, on the other hand, the Jews, that priestly people, who in opposing their enemies and conquerors were ultimately satisfied with nothing less than a radical revaluation of their enemies' values. That is to say, an act of the most spiritual revenge. This was in keeping with the claims of a priestly people, the people of the most repressed priestly vengefulness. It was the Jews who, with awe-inspiring consistency, dared to invert the aristocratic value equation, good, noble, powerful, beautiful, happy, favored by the gods, and maintained with the furious hatred of the underprivileged and impotent that only the wretched are the good, the poor, the powerless, the lowly are the only good people, the suffering, the deprived, the sick, the ugly are the only pious people, the only ones saved. Whereas you, the powerful and noble, are on the contrary, the evil, the cruel, the lustful, the insatiate, the godless, to all eternity. You shall be the unblessed, accursed, and damned. You shall be the unblessed, accursed, and damned. And Nietzsche asks, did this serve life? Did this make human beings stronger, more honest, more alive? Or did it make them resentful, guilty, self-hating, small? He will spend the next essay answering these questions about guilt, about conscience, about what it costs to carry the weight of the moral debt that slave morality has placed on the human animal. Nietzsche writes, "To breed an animal that is permitted to promise, is that not precisely the paradoxical task which nature has set herself in regard to man? Is it not the real problem of man? The fact that this problem has been solved to a large extent must seem all the more remarkable to one who appreciates fully the strength of the opposing force of forgetfulness. Forgetfulness, the beginning of Essay 2 with an unexpected word. Forgetfulness, not guilt, not conscience, not punishment. Forgetfulness, which Nietzsche calls an active faculty, not a weakness, not a failure of memory, but the positive capacity of the healthy animal to let things go, to move through experience without being crushed by it, without dragging the past into every present moment." He continues, "Forgetfulness is not merely a vis inertiae, as the superficial imagine. It is rather an active and, in the strictest sense, positive faculty of repression. What we experience and absorb enters our consciousness as little during its digestion as does the whole manifold process by which our physical nourishment takes place. To close the doors and windows of consciousness for a time, to remain undisturbed by the noise and struggle through which our underworld of utility organs work with and against one another. A little quietness, a little tabula rasa of consciousness, to make room for new things. This is the utility of forgetfulness, which I have described. The utility of forgetfulness. The healthy animal digests experience and moves on, without the accumulated weight of everything that has happened hanging around its neck. And then, into this picture of healthy forgetfulness, Nietzsche introduces the counter-principle. He continues, "This necessarily forgetful animal, in whom forgetfulness represents a force and form of strong health, has developed for himself a counter-faculty, a memory, with whose assistance forgetfulness is, in certain cases, put out of action, the memory of the will, so that between the original I will, I shall do, and the actual discharge of the will, its act, a world of strange, new things, circumstances, even acts of will may be interposed, without breaking this long chain of will. What does this presuppose? How stiff and severe these preconditions for breeding that will in man which can promise. What a fearful price has been paid for the development of human responsibility, the entire history of the thing, the fearful price. To be able to promise, to be able to say, I will, and mean it, and keep it, across days, across months, across years. This capacity had to be trained into the human animal, and the training was not gentle. He continues, how does one create a memory for the human animal? How does one impress something upon this partly obtuse, partly flighty mind, attuned only to the passing moment, in such a way that it stays? One can well believe that the answers and methods for solving this primeval problem were not precisely gentle. Perhaps indeed there was nothing more fearful and uncanny in the whole prehistory of man than his mnemotechnics. Something is branded in so that it stays in memory. Only that which never ceases to hurt stays in the memory. This is a first principle of the most ancient and unfortunately the most enduring human psychology. Only that which never ceases to hurt stays in the memory. The most honest observation about the ancient relationship between pain and memory, between punishment and the obligation to keep promises. We do not remember what was pleasant. We remember what hurt, and the human animal was trained to keep promises through the association of breaking them with pain, severe pain. He continues, "These Germans have used fearful means to make themselves a memory, to get mastery over their base plebeian instincts and the brutality of their instincts. Think of old German punishments, for example, stoning, the wheel, piercing with stakes, drawing and quartering, boiling the criminal in oil or wine, the popular flaying alive, cutting out of flesh from the chest, and also the practice of smearing the wrongdoer with honey and leaving him in the blazing sun, a prey to flies. By the help of such images and precedents, one at last retains in memory 5 or 6 I will nots, and there one has the origin of conscience. There one has the origin of conscience, not the voice of God, not the innate moral sense, not the gift of divine reason, the trained memory of pain, the animal that learned to avoid certain behaviors, not because they were intrinsically wrong, but because they were reliably painful. And eventually, the pain was internalized. The external punishment was replaced by the internal one, which we call bad conscience, or guilt, or the voice of conscience. He continues, during the longest period of human history, punishment was not inflicted because the miscreant was held responsible for his act, but rather, as parents still punish their children from anger at some damage that has been suffered by the person who inflicts the punishment. This anger was held in check and modified by the idea that every injury has its equivalent and can be paid off, even if only through the pain of the culprit. The pain of the culprit as payment. This is the origin of the equivalence between debt and punishment, between guilt and suffering, the idea that wrong can be paid for, that the debtor can make the creditor whole, by giving what they have most, what cannot be taken away, their own pain, their own body, their own life. He continues, let us be clear as to the logic of this whole method of compensation. It is strange enough, an equivalence is provided by the creditor receiving, instead of a literal compensation for an injury, a recompense in the form of a kind of pleasure, the pleasure of being allowed to vent his power freely upon one who is powerless, the pleasure of doing violence. The enjoyment in doing violence is in proportion as it raises him or seems to raise him in the social scale. It is an incitement and a foretaste of higher rank. An incitement and foretaste of higher rank. Punishment as the pleasure of the powerful over the powerless. Nietzsche does not excuse this. He names it, because naming it is the beginning of understanding it, and understanding it is the beginning of moving beyond it. He continues, the feeling of guilt, of personal obligation, had its origin, as we saw, in the oldest and most primitive personal relationship that there is, the relationship between buyer and seller, creditor and debtor. It was here that one person first encountered another person and measured himself against him. No grade of civilization, however low, has been discovered in which nothing of this relationship has been noticeable. Prices, equivalents, values, measuring and weighing. This pervades, in a certain sense, everything, everything, everything. Guilt as debt, as the unpaid obligation, as what is owed and not yet given, and the creditor demands payment. And if the debtor cannot pay in money or goods, the creditor takes what is available, the body, the freedom, the wife, the children, and eventually the pain. He continues, making promises, remembering promises. The development of man's memory of the will created moral responsibility. And this responsibility is connected with a tremendous amount of terror and pain. Now let us look at the concept Schuld, guilt. This concept had its origin in the very material and objective concept of Schulden, debt. Bad conscience is an illness. There is no doubt of that. But an illness as pregnancy is an illness. An illness as pregnancy is an illness. The most important metaphor of Essay 2, bad conscience is not simply a disease to be cured. It is a process, a painful, necessary, creative process from which something new is born. The illness of pregnancy produces the child. The illness of bad conscience produces the inward-turning, self-examining, self-overcoming human being who is something new, something unprecedented, something that did not exist before this illness. He continues, I regard the bad conscience as the serious illness that man was bound to contract under the stress of the most fundamental change he ever experienced. That change when he found himself finally enclosed within the walls of society and of peace. The situation that faced sea animals when they were compelled to become land animals or perish was the same that faced these half animals, well adapted to the wilderness, to war, to prowling, to adventure. Suddenly all their instincts were disvalued and suspended. They must now walk on their feet and bear themselves, whereas hitherto they had been borne by the water. A terrible heaviness lay upon them. A terrible heaviness. The animal that was free, that roamed, that followed its instincts, directly, without the overlay of society, without the prohibition, without the law, suddenly enclosed in civilization. And all its instincts, which had been safe, which had been natural, which had been the animal strength, were now forbidden, were now wrong, were now the source of punishment. And the animal, which could no longer discharge its instincts outward, turned them inward. He continues, all instincts that do not discharge themselves outwardly turn inward. This is what I call the internalization of man. Thus it was that man first developed what was later called his soul. The entire inner world originally as thin as if it were stretched between two membranes, expanded and extended itself, acquired depth, breadth, and height, in the same measure as outward discharge was inhibited. Those terrible bulwarks with which the organization of the state protected itself against the old instincts of freedom, punishments belong to these bulwarks, brought it about that all those instincts of wild, free, prowling man turned backward against man himself. Enmity, cruelty, joy in persecuting, in attacking, in change, in destruction, all this turned against the possessors of such instincts. That is the origin of the bad conscience. That is the origin of the bad conscience. The instincts that could not go out went in. The cruelty that could not be expressed toward the enemy was turned toward the self and became the instrument of self-torture, self-criticism, self-punishment, which we call conscience. He continues, bad conscience is an illness, but an illness in the same sense as pregnancy is. Let us seek its conditions. It presupposes that an unprecedented change in position and mode of living occurred to man, the change which came when he found himself enclosed within society's walls and peace. Enmity, cruelty, joy in persecution, in attacking, in destroying, all this turned against the possessors of such instincts. He continues, my idea is that the consciousness of guilt, the bad conscience, had not its origin, as people believe, in the idea of God. On the contrary, the idea of God first received its content and its power to crush after bad conscience was already established, and conscience torturers got hold of the religious premise. After bad conscience was already established, the reversal of what most people assume, most people believe God revealed the law. The law established guilt. Guilt produced bad conscience. Nietzsche says bad conscience came first, from the inward turning of the frustrated instincts, from the pain of being enclosed in civilization. And then God was introduced as the creditor to whom the infinite debt was owed. He continues, man with his need for self-torture, his spiritual cruelty, once the idea of God is introduced, proceeds to interpret animal instinct as guilt before God. He stretches himself upon the contradiction between God and devil. He ejects from himself all his denial of nature, of actuality, of all reason as a sin against God. He projects his drive toward the null, his nostalgia for the void. The pessimist Schopenhauer was right here, at least. Guilt feels good to the one who has no other way of feeling good. Guilt feels good to the one who has no other way of feeling good. The most devastating insight of Essay 2, the person who cannot overcome, cannot create, cannot act from strength, cannot give from abundance, has one remaining pleasure, one way of feeling something, something that confirms their own existence. The pleasure of guilt, of self-accusation, of the punishment that at least proves that there is a self worth punishing. The person who has learned to take pleasure in their own suffering because suffering was the only thing they were taught to value in themselves. He continues, Christianity has been the most fatal and seductive lie that has ever existed. The European man who is cured of the Christian God still stands in front of the ruins of that faith, feels obligated to do more for morality than ever. The form of religion changes, the moral core remains. Even atheists are infected by the guilt, by the self-denial, by the sense of debt that has no creditor, but still must be paid. But still must be paid. The debt without a creditor, the guilt without a God, the conscience that survives the death of God and goes on accusing without knowing what it is accusing for, or to whom the debt is owed. This is the human condition that Nietzsche describes in Essay 2, the most psychological essay, the most penetrating, the most difficult to bear. Nietzsche writes, "Perhaps there is nothing so terrible and so mysterious in the whole prehistory of man as his mnemotechnics. Something is branded in so that it stays in memory. Pain is the most powerful aid to mnemonics. A thing must be burnt in so that it stays in the memory. Only what does not cease to hurt stays in the memory. Only what does not cease to hurt stays in the memory." He continues, "In this matter, debtor and creditor are relevant, and you will certainly know what was the purpose of the creditor's rights. Lean on everything as compensation for the unpaid debt. The body of the debtor supplied the creditor with a pleasant feeling of power over the powerless. The good of the creditor lay in being permitted to pour scorn without consequence on a powerless person, to inflict on him the voluptuousness of doing evil. This comfort increases in proportion. As the creditor stands lower in the social order and can easily appear to himself as a taste of a higher class, a taste of a higher class. The creditor who punishes tastes power, the power that was otherwise unavailable to them, and this is why punishment has always attracted the most enthusiastic participation of those who otherwise had no power at all." He continues, "Even if the legal subject here is only the community, it can also be applied to the individual. If the community suffers from the injury of one of its members, the injured community will recover its loss by making the offender suffer. Vengeance, not punishment, vengeance. And the community has been the embodiment of this vengeance for all of human history. Through the law, which is the formalized, institutionalized, licensed version of the ancient right of the stronger to punish the weaker. The licensed version of the ancient right." He continues, "With the increase of power, a community ceases to attach so much importance to the trespasses of the individual, because these can no longer be considered so dangerous and subversive for the whole. The wrongdoer is no longer outlawed and repudiated. He can no longer be cast out as an equal no longer worthy of being considered. The man of power, the noble man, says to himself, 'The thief is my property. I can use him or I can forgive him.' And with forgiveness, he demonstrates his power more than with punishment. With forgiveness, he demonstrates his power. The most counterintuitive insight of the entire genealogy. The strong person forgives, not from weakness, not from sentiment, not from the moral instruction that forgiveness is virtuous, from power, because the strong person can afford to forgive, does not need the satisfaction of punishment, does not need. the debtor's pain. The weak person needs the pain, cannot afford to forgive, because forgiveness would be the final proof of their powerlessness. He continues, justice, which began with the maxim everything is payable, everything must be paid back, ends by conniving at the escape of those who cannot pay. It ends, as does every good thing on earth, by overcoming itself. This self-overcoming of justice, one knows the beautiful name it has given itself: grace, mercy, the privilege of the most powerful. And beyond this, a laughing disapproval of justice itself. Grace as the privilege of the most powerful, not the morality of the weak, the luxury of the strong, who can afford to let the debt go, because they never needed the payment in the first place. He continues, the man of resentment is not upright and naive, nor honest and direct with himself. His soul squints, his spirit loves hiding places. Secret paths and back doors attract him. He knows how to keep silent, how to wait, how to make himself temporarily small and humble. The noble man has an entirely different enemy to honor and respect. He is unable to take seriously for long his enemies, his accidents, even his misdeeds. That is the sign of strong and rich natures who need not forgive much because they know how to forget quickly. They know how to forget quickly. The return to forgetfulness. The healthy animal that digests experience and moves on without the accumulated weight of every injury, every slight, every wrong done. The noble type forgets, not because they are weak, but because they are strong. Strong enough not to need the grievance, not to need the resentment, not to need the slow, patient revenge of those who cannot forgive because they cannot forget. He continues, the noble man lives in confidence and candor with himself. The man of ressentiment has neither an upright nor a naive spirit. No action on his part is complete. No emotion he has is pure. Everything he thinks or feels has been contaminated by the reaction against something outside himself. He lives only in relation, in reaction. He cannot act. He can only react. And his values are the values of reaction, the values of the person who defines themselves by what they are against, not by what they are for. Not by what they are for. And Nietzsche says, this is not morality. This is the inability to create one's own values, compensated by the destruction of the values of others. This is the slave revolt in all its psychological and historical and deeply uncomfortable complexity. Nietzsche writes, if we place ourselves at the end of this tremendous process, where the tree at last brings forth fruit, where society and the morality of custom at last reveals what it has simply been the means to, then we discover that the ripest fruit is the sovereign individual, like only to himself, liberated again from morality of custom, autonomous and supermoral. For the autonomous man and the ethical man are mutually exclusive. In him we find a proud consciousness, quivering in every muscle of what has at last been achieved. A real consciousness of power and freedom, of feeling of human completion. The sovereign individual, the culmination of the entire process of civilization, of guilt, of bad conscience, of the long training of the human animal, through pain and memory and the obligation to promise, the sovereign individual who has absorbed all of this discipline, all of this training, all of this memory, and has emerged on the other side, free. Not free because they ignored the discipline, free because they mastered it. He continues, this man who has become free, who really has the right to make promises, this master of free will, this sovereign man, how should he not be aware of his superiority over all those who cannot promise and guarantee themselves? How much trust, how much fear, how much reverence he arouses. He merits all three, and in particular his self-mastery, his consciousness of power, his domination over himself has been absorbed into him as his instinct, as the dominating instinct. What would he call this dominating instinct, assuming he feels the need to give it a name? The answer is beyond doubt. This sovereign man calls it his conscience. His conscience. The conscience of the sovereign individual is not the guilty conscience of the slave, not the self-torturing conscience of the one who cannot pay the infinite debt. It is the proud conscience of the one who has mastered themselves, who can promise and keep promises, not from fear of punishment, from the sovereign will that is its own law. He continues, there is something entirely different from the bad conscience. The bad conscience arose from the turning inward of the instincts. But this conscience is the proud feeling that finally the contract is fulfilled. The long, long promise has been kept. The long training through which mankind became reliable enough to promise has produced as its final flower the person who needs no external compulsion, no threat, no punishment, who has internalized the law so completely that the law and the self are no longer distinguishable. This person is the end product of civilization. The end product of civilization, the person who has gone on all the way through the guilt, the bad conscience, the entire long history of civilization's training, and come out the other side, not as the person who needed no training, who was always free, but as the person who was trained and overcame the training and became free through the training, not despite it, because of it. This is the sovereign individual, the goal toward which the entire painful, bloody, tortured history of human civilization was moving. Nietzsche writes, one cannot fail to see, at the end of all this, what it is that really arouses the indignation of philosophers against Schopenhauer. It is this, that Schopenhauer praised pity and called it the basis of morality, as if pity were not exactly the most fundamental symptom of the will's weakness, as if pity were not the opposite of exactly the life-affirming instincts. The deep hostility and irony which Schopenhauer directs toward philosophy, that is what irritates. And then the systematic attempt to present existence itself as something deserving denial, as if existence, as such, were not enough. As if existence as such were not enough. The preview of Essay 3, the longest essay, the most complex, the most important for understanding what Nietzsche is ultimately arguing, the ascetic ideal, the ideal of self-denial, of suffering voluntarily chosen, of the body rejected. treat it as something to be escaped. Is this virtue, or is it the symptom of something much darker? He continues, an ascetic life is a self-contradiction. A resentment without equal reigns in it. The resentment of an insatiate instinct and ambition that would be master, not over something in life, but over life itself, over its deepest, strongest, most fundamental conditions. Here an attempt is made to employ strength to dam up the very sources of strength. Here the eye, turned jaundiced and resentful against physiological prosperity itself, in particular against the expression of prosperity, beauty, and joy. Satisfaction is experienced and sought in failure, decay, pain, mischance, ugliness, voluntary punishment, self-castigation, self-sacrifice. Voluntary punishment, self-castigation, self-sacrifice, called virtues, praised as the highest good, taught to children as the ideal. What is this, really, beneath the moral language, beneath the theological justification, beneath the centuries of praise for the self-denying life? What is this? He will answer in Essay 3, but he has already planted the seed of the answer. Here, at the end of Essay 2, the ascetic ideal is the ideal of people who are too weak to affirm life, who can only say no, who have made no into a religion, into a morality, into the standard by which all affirmation is judged and found wanting. This is the enemy that Nietzsche identifies in the genealogy. Not the strong person, not the noble person, not even the violent person, the priest, who has made weakness into the highest value and has convinced the strong to be ashamed of their strength. This is the achievement of the ascetic ideal, and Essay 3 will examine it in full. That is the end. Part 1, the preface, Essay 1, Essay 2 of the Genealogy of Morals by Friedrich Nietzsche. And what has happened here? Nietzsche has asked the question that no one else had quite asked before. Not, are our moral values correct? But, where did our moral values come from? And who made them? And why? And what does their origin say about their value? And he has found the answer. That what we call good and evil was not given by God, was not discovered by reason, was not the natural law written in the human heart. It was created by specific people, in specific circumstances, with specific needs and specific resentments. The noble class called themselves good, and the weak merely bad. Then the weak, in the most extraordinary, creative, revolutionary act in the history of human thought, called themselves good, and called the strong evil, and made it stick. For 2,000 years, through Christianity, through the morality of self-denial, through the glorification of suffering, through the promise that the meek shall inherit the earth, and the inheritance is the bad conscience, the guilt, the debt that can never be repaid, the creditor that can never be satisfied, the illness that Nietzsche calls bad conscience, which is an illness like pregnancy, painful, necessary, productive, and which produces eventually the sovereign individual who has gone through all the training, all the guilt, all the discipline, and emerged on the other side, free, not because they escaped the history of morality, because they mastered it, survived it, overcame it, and found on the other side their own conscience, not the guilty conscience, the proud conscience of the person who can promise and keep promises from their own strength, not from fear. This is part 1 of the Genealogy of Morals. Part 2 is Essay 3, The Ascetic Ideal, the longest essay, the most complex, the most important. What does it mean to deny life? What does it mean to say no to the body, to suffering, to beauty, to joy? Why would anyone do this? What does it serve? Who benefits? And what is the only thing that can defeat it? This is part 2 of the Genealogy of Morals. Coming. Stay with me. Welcome back to the classic mind. Part 1 gave us the question, where did morality come from? And the answer, the Slave Revolt, in which the weak overturned the values of the strong by calling strength evil and weakness good. The origin of guilt as the unpaid debt to the creditor who demands payment in pain and bad conscience. The illness of the inward-turned instincts, the soul created from repressed animal energy. The illness of pregnancy, painful, necessary, productive. Part 2 is Essay 3, the longest essay, the most important, the one that Nietzsche spent his entire intellectual life building toward. The ascetic ideal. What does it mean when a human being says no to life, when they deny the body, when they embrace suffering, when they choose poverty over wealth, ugliness over beauty, weakness over strength, silence over speech, death over life? Why? For whom? What does it serve? And what happens that this ideal was serving dies? What does self-denial mean without a God to deny yourself for? What remains? Nietzsche spends 28 sections of extraordinary prose answering this question, and the answer will change how you see every spiritual tradition, every philosophy, every culture, every value you hold. This is part 2 of the Genealogy of Morals by Friedrich Nietzsche. Essay 3, The Ascetic Ideal. Nietzsche writes, what do ascetic ideals mean? In the case of artists, nothing or too many things. In the case of philosophers, something like a nose and a sixth sense for the most favorable preconditions of higher spirituality. In the case of women, at best an additional seductive charm, a touch of morbidity in the beautiful. In the case of the physiologically deformed and dyspeptic, an attempt to see themselves as too good for this world. In the case of priests, a pretext, and in the case of saints, and on the other hand, a pretext for hibernation, their novissima gloriae cupido, their resting in nothingness. But the fact that the ascetic ideal has meant so much to man expresses the fundamental fact of human will, its horror vacui, its need of a goal. Man would sooner will nothingness than not will at all. Man would sooner will nothingness than not will at all. The last line of section 1 of the longest essay Nietzsche ever wrote, the most important sentence in the entire genealogy. Man would sooner will nothingness than not will at all. The human being needs a goal, needs a direction, needs a meaning, needs something to point toward, even if that something is emptiness, even if that goal is suffering, even if that meaning is the denial of meaning itself. The will must have an object, and the ascetic ideal has been the most successful object in human history, because it provides exactly what the human will requires: a goal, a direction, a meaning, even if that goal is the emptying of goals, even if that direction is away from life, even if that meaning is the overcoming of meaning. Man would sooner will nothingness than not will at all. Remember this. Everything else in Essay 3 depends on it. Nietzsche writes, "What does the philosopher see in the ascetic ideal?" A quite definite answer has long been ready, and we should remember it. He sees in it an optimum condition for the highest and boldest spirituality, and smiles thereby. Does he deny existence in this? He affirms his existence, and only his existence, thereby. And this perhaps happens with such thoroughness that he keeps in himself a general repugnance against all here, all now, all reality. He regards these as an enemy to be overcome. He regards these as an enemy, the philosopher who needs certain conditions to think clearly: quiet, solitude, the absence of distraction, the reduction of bodily appetite, the narrowing of social obligation. Why? Not from hatred of the body, not from genuine asceticism, but from the recognition that the thinking requires a certain kind of space, and that space is incompatible with the full engagement of the senses, the full immersion in society, the full satisfaction of every appetite. He continues, "Every animal, including la bête philosophe, instinctively strives for an optimum of favorable conditions under which it can expand all its strength and achieve its maximum feeling of power. Every animal, instinctively and with a subtle flair that is above all reason, has a loathing of every kind of disturber and hindrance that obstructs or could obstruct its path to the optimum. The philosopher dreads marriage as he dreads children and the social ties and duties that bind him, not from any hatred of children or wives or affection generally, but because certain conditions are necessary for his work. He needs silence. He needs control of his time. He needs solitude without the claims of love and the demands of society. These are the conditions. Is the costume that the philosopher adopts to protect these conditions. The costume the philosopher adopts, not genuine asceticism, strategic asceticism, the use of the ascetic appearance to secure the conditions that the philosophical work requires. He continues, "Let us above all not try to defend philosophers in this respect, from the charge leveled at them. The asceticism of the philosopher is not a renunciation of the world. It is an affirmation of the conditions under which the philosopher can affirm himself most fully. He says no to the social world in order to say yes to the thinking. He says no to pleasure in order to say yes to the work. He says no to the body in order to say yes to the spirit. This is not the hatred of life. It is the love of a particular kind of life, the life of the mind. The philosopher's asceticism serves life, even as it appears to deny it. The philosopher's asceticism serves life. This is the first distinction, the first division between the asceticism that Nietzsche will defend and the asceticism that he will attack. the asceticism that serves life by creating the conditions for a particular kind of life, and the asceticism that attacks life itself, that says no to life as such, not to a particular way of living, but to the living itself. That is what Nietzsche is after. That second kind, which is the priest's asceticism, not the philosopher's. Nietzsche writes, "How does the artist relate to the ascetic ideal? Let us first consider the case of Richard Wagner." Wagner was a Schopenhauerian, and Schopenhauer said of music that it is the will itself made audible, not a representation of the will itself. And so, for a Schopenhauerian, music is either a way of expressing the will and affirming it, or a way of pacifying the will and denying it. Wagner chose the second path. He used music not to affirm life, but to console people for life's shortcomings, to create in his audiences the yearning for redemption, the longing for escape, the desire for the release of death. This is Parsifal. This is Tristan. This is the Ring, the ascetic ideal in musical form. The ascetic ideal in musical form. Nietzsche, who had loved Wagner with the passion of the convert, who had written his first book as a celebration of Wagner, who had believed that Wagner was the rebirth of the Dionysian spirit in modern Europe, who then turned and saw that Wagner was the opposite, not the affirmation of life, the most sophisticated, most seductive, most irresistible denial of it. He continues, "But let us leave Wagner. The philosopher's view of the ascetic ideal we know. The artist has no independent status in relation to philosophy. He leans on any available philosophy. He takes his colors from wherever he can find them. He depends, always depends, on something outside his art to give his art its meaning. And this is perhaps the deepest reason why artists have always leaned on the priest, or on the philosopher, or on some ideal that is not their own. Because the art alone without the ideal is not enough. It cannot sustain the artist's belief in its own importance. And the artist, above all else, needs to believe in the importance of what they are doing. The artist needs to believe. He continues, "So much is certain that Wagner worshipped in his later period the ascetic ideal, with the result that we got Parsifal, and this result I regard as a catastrophe, not because Parsifal is ugly, it is beautiful, but because the beauty is in the service of self-denial, of the resignation of the will, of the pity that Schopenhauer celebrated and Nietzsche despised. When art says life is suffering, and the way out of suffering is the denial of will, the death of desire. When art says this, art has become the servant of the ascetic ideal, and Nietzsche prefers silence to this service. Nietzsche prefers silence. He continues, "I oppose the ascetic ideal with an ideal of my own, and it is not a new ideal. It is the oldest ideal, the ideal of the Greek, of Homer, of Pindar, of the tragedians, the ideal of saying yes to life, even to its suffering, even to its tragedy, even to its chaos. Yes, even so. Yes, even so. Yes, the Dionysian yes, the affirmation that does not require the world to be better than it is, that says yes to what is as it is, with full knowledge of what it is. This is the opposite of the ascetic ideal. Not a different asceticism, its opposite. The willingness to be fully in the world, without the escape, without the denial, without the no dressed up as holiness, the yes, even so. Nietzsche writes, "What does the ascetic ideal mean in the case of the priest?" Here we are confronted with the most serious problem of the genealogy, because the priest is the most powerful type of man that history has yet produced, and the priest lives under the ascetic ideal, wills it, preaches it, enforces it. This is not costume, not strategy, not the philosopher's practical device for securing the conditions of thought. For the priest, the ascetic ideal is genuine. It is the form of their will to power. The form of their will to power. Stop. This is the pivot, the central insight of Essay 3. The priest who preaches self-denial, who practices poverty, who mortifies the flesh, who embraces suffering, is not escaping the will to power, is expressing it in the only form available to someone who has no other power. He continues, "The priest is powerful through his weakness. He dominates through his suffering. He leads through his surrender. He rules through his renunciation." How is this possible? Through the ascetic ideal, which gives to the weak the appearance of strength, which makes suffering into a credential, which transforms poverty into proof of election, and pain into proximity to the divine. The priest, who has no armies, no wealth, no physical power, controls the man with all three, by convincing him that what the priest lacks is what God values, and what the warrior has is what God condemns. What God values and what God condemns, the complete reversal of all ordinary value. He continues, "For consider how the priest fulfills his function. His flock is suffering. They come to him with their suffering, and he does not take the suffering away. He gives it meaning. That is the genius of the ascetic priest. He does not cure the disease, he interprets it. The disease is sin. The suffering is the consequence of sin. The redemption is possible through the suffering. So the suffering is not wasted. The suffering is the path. And this interpretation changes everything. The man who was suffering without meaning was desperate. The man who is suffering with meaning is saved. Not healed, saved. This is the miracle of the ascetic priest. He makes suffering meaningful, and the person who suffers meaningfully will follow the interpreter of their suffering anywhere. Will follow the interpreter of their suffering anywhere. He continues, "For this is what men need most, not the end of suffering, the meaning of suffering. They can endure almost anyhow if only they have a why. This is the priest's great secret, his great power, his great discovery. Give men a why, and they will endure anyhow. And the ascetic priest gives the most powerful why in human history. Your suffering is God's will. Your suffering is redemptive, of God's special attention. The ones who suffer most are closest to God. Your suffering is your salvation. Your suffering is your salvation, the most powerful idea in the history of human thought. In terms of the number of people it has organized, directed, consoled, and controlled." He continues, "I ask, what does it cost? What does the interpretation of suffering as sin and suffering as redemption, what does it cost the patient? The patient accepts the interpretation. The patient accepts that their suffering is their own fault, that they have sinned, that their nature, the animal nature, the instinctive nature, the nature that desires and enjoys and reaches toward life, is the source of the sin, and therefore the source of the suffering, and therefore the nature itself must be overcome, denied, mortified, punished, and this acceptance of guilt, this agreement with the priest's diagnosis, this is what the ascetic ideal costs. Nothing less than the person's relationship with their own nature, with their own life, with the very thing that they are, with the very thing that they are. This is the price of the ascetic ideal, the turning of the person against themselves, not as incidental damage, as the intended result. Because the person who is at war with themselves is the most easily controlled by the priest, who offers the diagnosis, the treatment, the absolution, and the terms of the eventual cure, which requires continued submission, continued self-denial, continued dependence on the one who manages the relationship with the divine, the priest, who has no other power and therefore needs this one completely. Nietzsche writes, "The ascetic priest has discovered what every great therapist has since discovered. The best remedy for the sense of powerlessness is the exercise of power. Any power will do. If you cannot exercise power outward, exercise it inward." And this is exactly what the ascetic priest teaches. Not how to overcome the enemy, how to overcome oneself. Not how to conquer the world, how to conquer the flesh. Not how to accumulate wealth, how to give it away. And in every case, the person who is powerless outwardly finds in the inward direction of their power a feeling of agency, a feeling of mastery, a feeling of strength. However illusory, however self-destructive, the feeling is real, and the feeling is what matters. The feeling is what matters. He continues, let us enumerate the means used by the ascetic priest to prevent the feeling of displeasure, to combat pain. The first remedy, general deadening of the feeling of life. The mechanical activity, the blessing that the machine can bring, doing something, anything, to escape the paralysis of suffering. Work, regular, mechanical, numbing, not because work produces anything valuable, but because work prevents thought, and thought returns to the pain. The second remedy, the formation of little pleasures accessible to all, the feeling of community, mutual assistance, the warmth of the herd, the pleasure of giving and receiving within a small circle of people who share the same suffering, the same interpretation, the same priest. This is the second technique, the formation of the community of the suffering, who find in each other's company the relief of recognition. We are not alone in our suffering. Others suffer too. God sees our suffering. God is moved by our suffering. And in this recognition, the suffering is bearable. Just barely. But barely is enough. For the priest, the third remedy, the orgasm of feeling, the most powerful, the most dangerous. This is the remedy that the ascetic priest deploys when the first two are insufficient. the arousal of the most powerful feeling of which man is capable. Guilt, the sense of sinfulness, the sense of being infinitely indebted, the sense of being unworthy of the simplest gift of existing. This is the most powerful, the most reliable, the most enduring remedy for suffering, because it is itself a suffering, but a suffering that is intense enough to displace all other suffering. The acute pain of guilt makes the chronic pain of existence bearable. By comparison, the person who is racked by guilt is too occupied with guilt to feel the ordinary suffering of the ordinary life. Too occupied with guilt, he continues, but this is terrible medicine. The person who is cured of the pain of existence by the pain of guilt has not been cured at all, has been given a more intense pain to distract from the original one, and the guilt grows as it is fed, as it is applied, as it is reinforced by the priest who needs it, until the guilt becomes the defining feature of the person's inner life, not incidentally, not as a side effect, as the intended result. The person who feels infinitely guilty, infinitely indebted, infinitely unworthy is the most docile, the most manageable, the most thoroughly controlled person in the history of the world. The most thoroughly controlled. He continues, and now I can name it directly. All these great cultivators of the feeling of guilt wish to be praised as the greatest benefactors and saviors of mankind, and this is their lie. The lie that they comfort, when in fact they deepen the wound. The lie that they heal, when in fact they make the illness chronic. The lie that they save, when in fact they create the condition from which they appear to offer salvation. The ascetic priest is not the doctor of the soul. He is the person who first makes the soul sick and then sells the remedy. The remedy that only he provides, that only his continued presence makes available. This is the business of the ascetic ideal. This is its economy. This is what it means in the case of the priest. This is the business of the ascetic ideal. Nietzsche writes, "The ascetic priest has discovered what every great therapist has since discovered. The best remedy for the sense of powerlessness is the exercise of power. Any power will do. If you cannot exercise power outward, exercise it inward." And this is exactly what the ascetic priest teaches. Not how to overcome the enemy, how to overcome oneself. Not how to conquer the world, how to conquer the flesh. Not how to accumulate wealth, how to give it away. And in every case, the person who is powerless outwardly finds in the inward direction of their power a feeling of agency, a feeling of mastery, a feeling of strength. However illusory, however self-destructive, the feeling is real, and the feeling is what matters. The feeling is what matters. He continues, let us enumerate the means used by the ascetic priest to prevent the feeling of displeasure, to combat pain. The first remedy, general deadening of the feeling of life, the mechanical activity, the blessing that the machine can bring, doing something, anything, to escape the paralysis of suffering, work, regular, mechanical, numbing, not because work produces anything valuable, but because work prevents thought, and thought returns to the pain. The second remedy, the formation of little pleasures, accessible to all. The feeling of community, mutual assistance, the warmth of the herd, the pleasure of giving and receiving within a small circle of people who share the same suffering, the same interpretation, the same priest. This is the second technique, the formation of the community, of the suffering, who find in each other's company the relief of recognition. We are not alone in our suffering. Others suffer too. God sees our suffering. God is moved by our suffering. And in this recognition, the suffering is bearable, just barely, but barely is enough. For the priest, the third remedy, the orgasm of feeling, the most powerful, the most dangerous. This is the remedy that the ascetic priest deploys when the first two are insufficient. The arousal of the most powerful feeling of which man is capable. Guilt, the sense of sinfulness, the sense of being infinitely indebted, the sense of being unworthy of the simplest gift of existing. This is the most powerful, the most reliable, the most enduring remedy for suffering, because it is itself a suffering, but a suffering that is intense enough to displace all other suffering. The acute pain of guilt makes the chronic pain of existence bearable. By comparison, the person who is racked by guilt is too occupied with guilt to feel the ordinary suffering of the ordinary life. Too occupied with guilt, he continues, but this is terrible medicine. The person who is cured of the pain of existence by the pain of guilt has not been cured, has been given a more intense pain to distract from the original one. And the guilt grows as it is fed, as it is applied, as it is reinforced by the priest who needs it, until the guilt becomes the defining feature of the person's inner life. Not incidentally, not as a side effect, as the intended result. The person who feels infinitely guilty, infinitely indebted, infinitely unworthy is the most docile, the most manageable, the most thoroughly controlled person in the history of the world. The most thoroughly controlled, he continues, and now I can name it directly. All these great cultivators of the feeling of guilt wish to be praised as the greatest benefactors and saviors of mankind. And this is their lie, the lie that they comfort when in fact they deepen the wound, the lie that they heal when in fact they make the illness chronic, the lie that they save when in fact they create the condition from which they appear to offer salvation. The ascetic priest is not the doctor of the soul. He is the person who first makes the soul sick and then sells the remedy that only he provides, that only his continued presence makes available. This is the business of the ascetic ideal. This is its economy. This is what it means in the case of the priest. This is the business of the ascetic ideal. Nietzsche writes, "Let us now consider the most serious question of Essay 3. What happens to the ascetic ideal when the God it serves is gone, when the creditor to whom the debt of guilt was owed ceases to be believed in, when science has made the literal truth of religion intellectually untenable, when the educated classes of Europe can no longer honestly hold what their grandparents held as obvious truth? What then? Does the guilt go away? Does the bad conscience dissolve? Does the ascetic ideal disappear along with the God it claimed to serve? Does the ascetic ideal disappear? He continues, I want to make a distinction. When I say God is dead, I do not mean that the idea of God has lost its force. I mean that the specific, the literal, the naive belief in the Christian God as literally existing, as literally demanding, as literally rewarding and punishing, has become untenable for those with eyes to see. But something else remains. The moral structure, the sense of obligation, the guilt, the self-denial, the hatred of the body, the suspicion of joy, the discomfort with power, the democratic leveling of all distinction. All of this remains even after God is gone, because these are not beliefs. They are habits trained into the blood over 2,000 years, and habits survive the ideas that produce them. Habits survive the ideas that produce them. Habits survive the ideas that produce them. He continues, the European morality of today is the Christianity of yesterday, without the theology, without the justification, without the narrative. Just the moral residue, the sense of duty, the guilt, the democratic egalitarianism, the suspicion of excellence, the hatred of hierarchy, these remain, and they will remain for a long time, because the training that produced them was thousands of years long, and the untrained habit does not disappear with the first generation that consciously rejects it. It goes underground, becomes secularized, takes new forms, finds new hosts, and continues to operate as powerfully as before, but without the justification, and therefore without the honest examination that a declared belief at least invites. Without the honest examination, he continues, this is the crisis that I am describing. Europe has lost the theological foundation of its morality, but it has kept the morality, and the morality without the foundation is the most dangerous possible thing, because the foundation at least was honest, at least said, this is where these values come from. Here is their justification. Here is their source. The morality without foundation says nothing of the kind. It simply insists, with all the fervor of the religious tradition that produced it, but without the religion, and cannot answer the question, why? Why should we be moral? Why should we prefer the weak to the strong? Why should equality be the supreme value? Why should self-sacrifice be praised? It cannot answer, and it will not tolerate the question. It will not tolerate the question. He continues, science, which so proudly declared the death of God, has it offered an alternative? Has science produced a new ideal to replace the ascetic one? Has science given us a reason to affirm life, a new meaning, a new why? I say no. Science has destroyed the old meaning and offered nothing in its place. Science describes, it does not prescribe. It tells us how things work. It does not tell us why they matter. And the person who looks to science for meaning will find facts and no meaning, and will be driven by the emptiness back to something, to any something, even nothingness, even the ascetic ideal in its secular forms. Because man would sooner will nothingness than not will at all. Man would sooner will nothingness than not will at all. The sentence from section 1 returned in its full force at the center of essay 3. He continues, let us take stock. The ascetic priest is the most powerful, most creative, most consequential figure in human history, who has organized more human beings around a single ideal than any warrior or king or philosopher. Through the genius of making suffering meaningful, through the genius of turning weakness into virtue, through the genius of the revaluation that turned the strong against themselves. And now, in the age of the death of God, the ascetic priest's God is gone, but the priest's function remains, and new priests appear in new forms, with new names, with new languages, but the same structure, the same logic, the same organization of suffering into meaning, the same turning of strength against itself, the same creation of guilt as the instrument of control. In political ideologies, in psychological frameworks, in the culture of permanent victimhood, in the endless demand for apology and atonement, from those who have never committed the specific wrong they are called to atone for. New priests, old asceticism. Man would sooner will nothingness than not will it all. New priests, old asceticism. Nietzsche writes, "I shall now examine whether science itself offers an opposition to the ascetic ideal. I expect at this point the angry demand, 'You are attacking the progress of knowledge. You are attacking the Enlightenment. You are praising irrationalism and mysticism and superstition.' No, I am not. I am asking a different question. Has science examined its own will to truth? Has science asked, why is truth desirable? Why should we prefer truth to untruth? What is the value of truth itself? Or has it simply assumed the value of truth without examination, taken truth as its highest value without ever asking whether truth is valuable? And if science has not examined this, then science itself is operating under an ideal that it has not questioned, the ascetic ideal, in the form of truth at any cost, even if truth destroys, even if truth negates, even if truth makes life impossible. Truth above all. This is the ascetic ideal. In its most refined form, its most cold, its most impersonal, its most apparently objective form. Truth above all. The ascetic ideal in its most refined form. He continues, "For consider what the will to truth demands. It demands the willingness to see what is actually there, however uncomfortable, however ugly, however threatening, however destructive of our previous beliefs, however incompatible with our desires. Truth at any cost. And this willingness to see the uncomfortable, to give up the comforting illusion for the harsh reality, is exactly what the ascetic ideal demands. Truth is asceticism. The will to truth is the most purified form of the ascetic will. The will to deprive oneself of every comfortable lie, of every pleasant fantasy, of every warm belief that does not survive examination. This is the will to truth, and it is the ascetic ideal in its philosophical costume. The ascetic ideal in its philosophical costume." He continues, "And so when science claims to be the enemy of religion, the conqueror of the ascetic ideal, I laugh. Science is the highest expression of the ascetic ideal, the truest form of it, the most self-consistent, the most uncompromising. The priest says, deny the body for God. The scientist says, deny the comforting illusion for truth. The priest says, mortify the flesh. The scientist says, mortify the ego. Kill the need for comfortable conclusions. Submit yourself to what the evidence shows, even if it destroys everything you believed. these are the same demand, in different languages, for different gods. The God of truth is still a God, and the will to worship it at all costs is still the ascetic will. The will to worship truth at all costs is still the ascetic will. He continues, but do not think I am against science or against truth. I am against the unexamined worship of truth. I am for the honest examination of why we value truth, and what truth costs, and whether that cost is always worth paying, because perhaps, in some cases, the beautiful illusion serves life better than the ugly truth, and perhaps the person who destroys every illusion in the name of truth has not achieved the highest form of consciousness, has merely achieved the most consistent, the most thoroughgoing, the most self-aware version of the ascetic will, which is still, at its root, the will to say no to the world as it is, to the life as it is, to the reality that requires something other than analysis to be fully inhabited. Truth alone is not enough to live by. Man cannot live by truth alone. He needs values, and values are not facts. They are decisions about what matters, whose source is not reason, but will, the will that affirms or the will that denies. And the will to truth, however noble, is still the will that denies. The world as it wishes to be seen, in favor of the world as it is, and the world as it is, seen through the eyes of science, is cold, impersonal, without purpose, without meaning, without value. And the person who lives only in that world has no reason to live except the habit, and the habit will not hold forever. The habit will not hold forever. He continues, this is the crisis. The death of God has not solved the problem of the ascetic ideal. It has intensified it, because the God at least gave a reason for the self-denial. The truth gives only the truth which is insufficient, and Europe, which has rejected God and worshipped truth and found in truth only the cold universe without purpose, is now the most nihilistic civilization in the history of the world, more thoroughly nihilistic than any civilization that openly practiced nihilism, because Europe does not know it is nihilistic. It still has the moral habits of the ascetic ideal, the guilt, the self-denial, the democratic leveling, the suspicion of excellence, the hatred of hierarchy, but it has no justification for these habits, no God to appeal to, no nature to appeal to, no reason, just the habit and the social pressure and the vague feeling that these values are right without knowing why. Nietzsche writes, "We have now seen what the ascetic ideal means for the philosopher, for the artist, for the priest, for science. And in every case, we find the same thing, a will, a strong will, a will that has direction and energy and the capacity for sustained effort, but directed in every case at the denial of something. The philosopher denies social obligation. The artist denies the constraints of ordinary experience. The priest denies the body and the instincts. Science denies comfortable illusion. All of this denial, all of this saying no, all of this will to nothingness. And I ask, is this the highest the human will is capable of? Is this the best we have done, the most ambitious, the most creative, to say no more and more elaborately, more and more consistently, more and more systematically? Is this human greatness? Is this human greatness? He continues, I do not think so, but I recognize something important. The ascetic ideal, however life-denying, is better than nothing. It is better than the absence of any ideal. It is better than the will's turning against itself in complete directionlessness. The ascetic ideal gives the will a direction, however destructive, and the directed will, however misdirected, is the precondition of any other achievement. The person who has learned to will through the ascetic ideal has the capacity for a different kind of willing, for the yes instead of the no, for the affirmation instead of the denial, for the creation instead of the mortification. But only if they can redirect, only if they can turn the enormous capacity for willing that the ascetic tradition has built in a different direction, the direction of affirmation, of life, of yes, the direction of affirmation. He continues, "This is the task, the great task, the task that I have set for the philosophers of the future. Not to destroy the ascetic tradition. It cannot be destroyed, too deeply rooted, too thoroughly trained, but to redirect it, to use the will that it has built for something other than denial, to say yes with the same force with which the ascetic has always said no, to affirm life with the same consistency with which the priest has denied it, to create values with the same discipline with which the ascetic has uncreated them. This is the task that I call the revaluation of all values, not the abolition of values, their revaluation, from no to yes, from denial to affirmation, from the will to nothingness to the will to life, from the will to nothingness to the will to life." Nietzsche writes, "What does it mean to say yes to life? It means accepting the world as it is, not as it should be. It means accepting the suffering as part of the whole, not as a punishment, not as a problem to be solved, not as the sign of sin, just as part of what life is, and affirming life with the suffering included. It means accepting the inequality of human beings, their different strengths, their different values, their different capacities for creation and destruction, and not demanding that the high be brought down to the level of the low, but celebrating the existence of the high and working to become higher oneself. It means accepting that the world does not owe you anything, that the gods are not watching over you, that fortune is not justice, that the suffering is not fair, that the distribution of gifts is not equal, and affirming all of this, not from despair, from the recognition that the world's indifference is the condition of genuine freedom, that the world which does not care about you is the world in which you can become what you are, not what you were told to be, not what the priest demands, not what the herd approves, what you are, what you are." He continues, "The will to power. This is the phrase that has been most misunderstood, most distorted, most deliberately falsified by those who came after me and claimed to speak in my name. The will to power is not the desire for dominion over others, not the appetite for conquest and subjugation. The will to power is the fundamental drive of all living things toward the expansion of their own vitality. The plant that grows toward the light, the animal that establishes its territory, the child that learns to walk, the artist that creates, the philosopher that thinks, the saint that practices the discipline that their vision requires. All of these are will to power, because all of these are the expression of a vitality that expands itself, that reaches beyond what it already is, that overcomes obstacles, not in order to dominate, in order to grow, in order to grow." He continues, And the ascetic ideal is also will to power, but directed inward, against itself, consuming itself, in the name of a higher goal. And I ask, is this necessary? Is it necessary for the will to turn against itself in order to grow? Must growth always be purchased with self-destruction? I do not think so. I think the self-overcoming that the ascetic ideal achieves through denial can be achieved through affirmation. The philosopher does not need to hate the body to think clearly. He only needs to find the right relationship with the body, the relationship that supports the thinking without destroying the body. The artist does not need to despise the world. To create beauty, he only needs to find in the world the material for beauty. The priest does not need to torture his congregation with guilt to give their suffering meaning. He only needs to find in the suffering the truth about what needs changing. All of these without the no, with the yes. This is the revaluation. This is the revaluation. Nietzsche writes, "Let me now pose the most extreme version of the question that the ascetic ideal raises. The most extreme test of whether a person truly affirms life, or only appears to. Imagine that this life, exactly as you have lived it and are living it, must be lived again and again and again, countless times, without any alteration. Every pain, every joy, every tedium, every moment of greatness, every moment of shame, every love, every loss, every beginning, every ending, repeated exactly forever. The eternal recurrence of the same. This is my thought, and I call it the most terrifying thought that has ever entered a human mind, because it confronts you with the question, is this life worth living? Not in some improved version. This life, as it has been, is it worth living forever? Could you will this? Could you say, yes, let it come again, let this exact life return forever? If you could say yes to this, then you have truly affirmed life. If you cannot, then you have not affirmed it. You have only tolerated it, endured it, waited for it to end. The eternal recurrence is the test. The eternal recurrence is the test. He continues, and the ascetic ideal fails this test, because the ascetic lives for the future, for the redemption, for the afterlife, for the escape, for the end of the cycle. The ascetic, by definition, cannot will the eternal recurrence, because the ascetic wills the ending of existence, not its repetition. The no that is at the heart of the ascetic ideal is the no to existence itself, the no to the body, the no to the world, the no to the life. And the eternal recurrence demands the yes, the total yes, the unconditional yes, the yes that includes every no, every pain, every failure, every moment of ugliness, every moment of mediocrity. The yes that says, even this, even all of this, I would will again. I would will again. He continues, this is Dionysus against the crucified. The Dionysian yes against the Christian no. The affirmation of life against the denial of life. The willingness to be fully in the world against the longing for the world's end. These are not equally valid positions. These are not both acceptable answers. I have a preference. I state it clearly. I am for Dionysus, for the yes, for the eternal recurrence of the same, for the life that is worth repeating forever. And I am against the ascetic ideal, against the no, against the life that is tolerated only because it leads somewhere else. I am for the life that is its own destination, its own justification, its own reward. I am for the life that is its own destination. Nietzsche writes, "What then are the values that I would put in the place of the ascetic ideal? Let me be direct. The will to power, in its genuine sense, the will to expand, to create, to overcome, to become more than what one was, the love of fate, amor fati, the willingness to love what is necessary, not to merely tolerate it, not to endure it, but to love it, to look at what is unavoidable and say, I would not have it different. This is what I wanted. This is what I choose. Even now, knowing everything, I choose this. The courage of the body, the health of the instincts, the joy of strength, the pleasure of the will in full expression. The self-overcoming that is not the overcoming of the self, but the overcoming by the self of its own limitations. Not the priest's self-torture, the warrior's discipline, not the denial of the body, the mastery of the body, not the rejection of desire, the direction of desire toward what is worth desiring. Not the rejection of desire, the direction of desire toward what is worth desiring. He continues, and what is worth desiring? Not pleasure for its own sake, not the relief of pain, not the comfort of the herd, not the approval of the crowd, not the praise of the priest, not the salvation of the afterlife. What is worth desiring? Excellence, the highest development of one's own particular gifts. Creation, the making of something that did not exist before, that only you could have made, that bears your mark and will survive you. Friendship with those who are worthy of it, the rare friendship of equals, who challenge each other, who tell each other the truth, who do not merely flatter. Solitude, the necessary solitude of the person who is doing what cannot be done in company, and the love of the earth, the literal earth, the physical world, the body, the senses, the pleasure of existing in a world of such beauty and such complexity and such inexhaustible interest. These are the values I would propose, not a morality, a set of values, not imposed, chosen, not for everyone, for those who can choose them, for those who can choose them. He continues, the noble morality, not the slave morality, which asks, how can I preserve myself? How can I avoid pain? How can I secure the approval of the herd? But the noble morality, which asks, what can I become? What is the highest form of what I am? What would I will if I were most fully myself? What would I create if I feared nothing? These are the questions of the noble morality, and the answers are different for every person, because the noble morality is not universal, not a single standard imposed on all. It is the standard that each person discovers for themselves in the process of becoming most fully what they are. Becoming most fully what they are, Nietzsche writes, let us now draw together what we have learned from the 3 essays of the genealogy. We began by asking, where did good and evil come from? And we found, from the slave revolt in morality, from the creative act of ressentiment, from the weak who could not strike directly and so struck spiritually and won. We then asked, where did guilt come from? And we found, from the ancient relationship of creditor and debtor, from the memory that was trained through pain, from the internalization of the instincts that civilization forbade, from the turning of the animal against itself. And we found the sovereign individual as the end product, the person who has gone through all the guilt and come out free, not despite the training, because of it. And now we have asked, what is the ascetic ideal? And we have found the most powerful, most creative, most consequential idea in human history. That suffering is meaningful. That self-denial is virtue. That weakness is strength. That the denial of life is the highest affirmation of a life beyond life. And we have found that this idea serves the will to power of those who have no other form of power available to them. The priest who dominates through weakness, who controls through guilt, who rules through the management of suffering. And we have found that with the death of God, the ascetic ideal does not disappear. It secularizes, it democratizes, it finds new hosts, new forms, new languages, new priests, and continues to operate as powerfully as before, but without the honesty of the declared belief, and without the examination that a declared belief invites. This is the crisis of the modern world, the ascetic ideal without God, the guilt without the creditor, the self-denial without the purpose, the no without the yes that would make the no meaningful, the no without the yes. He continues, and I have proposed the revaluation of all values, not the abolition of values, not the celebration of nihilism, not the embrace of chaos, the revaluation from no to yes, from the denial of life to its affirmation, from the will to nothingness to the will to life, through the recognition that the ascetic ideal is not the only way to give the will its direction. There is another way, the Dionysian way, the way of the yes, of the amor fati, of the eternal recurrence, of the willingness to live this life again and again and again, forever, without improvement, without redemption, without the promise of a better life elsewhere. This life, as it is, with everything it is, I would will it again. This is the answer to the ascetic ideal, not the no of the priest, but the yes of the warrior, not the self-denial of the saint, but the self-overcoming of the philosopher, not the guilt of the sinner, but the pride of the sovereign individual. These are different. These are opposed. These cannot be reconciled. And I have chosen, and I state my choice clearly, for anyone who has the ears to hear. I choose yes. I choose life. I choose the body. I choose the earth. I choose the world as it is. And I call anyone who chooses otherwise to examine their choice, honestly, without the protection of the inherited tradition, without the comfort of the herd's approval, just honestly. What do you actually value, and why, and who told you to value it? And what did they gain from your accepting their answer? What did they gain from your accepting their answer? He continues, I have spoken from the beginning about the value of values, and I end with the same question, the value of the ascetic ideal. And my answer is, it has served. It has served the will that had no other direction. It has given meaning to the suffering that had no other meaning. It has organized the human will into the enormous sustained effort that civilization requires. But it has cost. It has cost the full affirmation of life, the freedom of the instincts, the joy of the body, the honest relationship with what we are. And now, with the death of God, it costs more than it provides. The debt is greater than the benefit, and therefore the revaluation is necessary. Not comfortable, not safe, not welcome, necessary. Because the alternative is worse. The alternative is the will turning completely against itself, without even the dignity of the ascetic ideal's direction, without the priest's God, without the philosopher's truth, without the artist's beauty. just the turning, inward, in complete darkness. And from that darkness, nothing good has ever come, and nothing good ever will, and nothing good ever will. He continues, man would sooner will nothingness than not will at all. And so we must give the will something better to will than nothingness. And that better thing is not a new God, not a new priest, not a new ideal of self-denial. It is the yes, the unconditional yes, to this life, this world, this body, these instincts, this suffering, this joy, this totality. The yes that says, I would have it no different. I would will it again, forever. If this is too much for you, if this affirmation is beyond what you can honestly make, then at least be honest about what you are actually willing and why, and who benefits from your not willing. That is the least the genealogy asks, that you be honest about what you actually value and why. That is the beginning of the revaluation, and perhaps all that is needed to begin. This is Jamil, and you are listening to The Classic Mind.